So you also hear me talking about, at one point there when I'm walking around, I'm saying it's hard and it's getting harder. And that was true, and what I was referring to specifically was the trapping of the rabbits. When I first started getting them, it was pretty consistent every couple days. And then after that dry period with no rabbits, it got so much harder to trap for a couple different reasons. One is that rabbits are smart and they were figuring it out. The same traps that I was catching rabbits in before, I would go and set those up in all new areas and they weren't working. The rabbits were seeing them and just snipping my fishing line out of the way. And here again is the huge handicap of fishing line instead of snare wire, is the rabbits would just clip it off and it was just gone. So it was harder in that way. It was like the rabbits were communicating and word had gotten out and was spreading to all of these areas I hadn't been trapping, and yet the rabbits knew and weren't falling for it. So that was one thing I was referring to in it having gotten so much harder. And then the second thing was it was down in the low teens at that point, right? It was cold and the ground was frozen. So already it was hard enough to find open soil where I could drive stakes in for my traps, which I had to do because of not having snare wire and needing a lifting mechanism. But now it was that much harder because the ground was frozen and so hard to get stakes into solid frozen ground. Had to look way further, I had to range way farther, spots were few and far between. That said, I was putting every effort into setting out new traps. So I would pick an area, I would, scout all around my area, the mainland and my peninsula, and I would choose what was the next area that I was going to focus on trapping in. And then I would go to that area and I would try to set up like 5 to 10 snares in that area. So that day, my amazing 2-rabbit day, I'm saying, and I haven't even checked my new area. So that was a day that I had spent time setting up a whole new zone. It was my North Hollow. And you can see, as I'm going to it, you can see the water ahead of me. That's up and over my peninsula from where my shelter was and heading towards that north inlet. So that was my newest zone. And I think it was right after I saw the rabbit. I'm aware that it's coming on to Halloween, which is the Day of the Ancestors, right? The Day of the Dead is November 1st in a lot of places. And I was having such a strong connection to ancestors out there, and feasting the ancestors felt so important to me. So I needed the food just period for myself, but I also just felt so important to really celebrate and be present with that day. Especially because those holidays came from people living really closely to the land. So with how close I was living to the land at that point, it just felt even more significant. So I think it's a day or two before Halloween, and I go and I check my traps, and for the first time in a while, I had a rabbit in one of the first areas that I checked, and it was a lifting pole snare. So a particular style that's using, and I spoke about this in one of my other videos, that's using a pendulum weight of a dead log to lift the rabbit up and off its feet. So while I had been trying to lift the game really high off its feet because of the foxes, the truth is that I came to discover that it was better if I lifted them just partway off of the ground and not completely off of their feet, because it seemed like they were struggling more and more likely to snip their way out of my snare if they were lifted completely off the ground, rather than just 2 feet off the ground. So I started using lighter weights and tension mechanisms to get them off the ground, and you can see that with both of the two I got in this episode. They're not totally off of the ground. So yeah, the one rabbit, and it was a big meaty rabbit, and it was so exhilarating. And then I went to check my other traps, and boom, 2 rabbits in one day. That was like something I had been praying for so long, to have more food than I could eat in a day. To know that I had food for a couple days in a row was amazing. It was so amazing. So then you see me processing those rabbits, and you can see me very, very carefully peeling off the skin. So I think that around the time of the molt, their skin was a little bit more tender and easy to tear because of all of the changes that were going on. So I had to be super careful. And what you can't see in the footage is how beautiful the coat was. After the molt, it was so much thicker and fluffier, and they still had the brown fur, but they had grown an entire new coat of white fur that was longer and sticking out beyond the brown fur. So you can almost see where the fur is kind of parting. It's a little bit darker beneath. That's because it's a whole new coat in addition to the summer coat. So that was really cool to see. So yeah, you see me very carefully skinning to set those aside, because with the molt, the rabbit fur was getting so warm and plushy and beautiful. So being very careful with that. And then you see after that a scene of me picking through the intestines. And that was a really important practice, and I could imagine the average person would be a little confused what I was doing there. I think you can see some cut up parts there. But again, I was being so conservative with every bit of calorie on those animals. I was eating everything I could. And a lot of the fat of the animal is on the skin, so the careful membraning, and then I would set that fat aside in the lid of my pot, and then I would go through all of the internal organs, and I would pull off all of the fat around the organs. So the kidneys have a ton of fat, and then the intestines have a lot, and it's this very kind of ropey, thin layers of tissue around the intestines. And I had to be so careful doing that, and I had to really develop my techniques because the intestines were thin and I didn't want to break them. So I would just carefully peel all of that fatty tissue away from the intestines and put it aside. And one whole rabbit would yield just the teensiest little bit, but I would render that fat, and then that would be the fat that I would cook the organs and then brown the legs in. And I wish that they had shown me rendering that, because it's quite a contrast, and it was really, I mean, funny and kind of like, ugh, to be watching the episode and hear Jordan talking about, geez, I don't have any fat left. All I have is this tongue and this, that, and this, that, and then seeing him rendering fat, and to his, like, seeing that his, like, no fat was still like a quart of fat and cracklings, and my no fat was like a half a thimbleful of fat. So yeah, it was a whole different situation. But that was what I was doing, picking through those intestines. And then, so that was a couple days before Samhain, or Halloween, and I ate those rabbits, but I definitely wanted to be sure to set aside food for my Halloween feast. So I saved the most delectable parts of the rabbits, which are the back straps, the muscles running along the spine, what we call loin in some animals, tenderloin in the front and loin in the back. And I saved those aside, and of course they were frozen solid in no time, so very easy to save. And then another beautiful thing was Halloween morning, I got a squirrel in one of my snares, which was amazing. So I had the food I had saved just in case, and then I also had fresh meat. So I felt like the ancestors were really seeing me and honoring the fact that I was wanting to honor them by bringing fresh meat to my traps. So another thing is that Halloween is my mother's birthday, and I thought about her a lot out there. I'm an only child, and my parents divorced when I was young. So my immediate family, my nuclear family, was just me and my mom all my life. So we're very close. And the summer right before launch, my mom fell off of a ladder and broke her leg really badly. Her leg went through the rungs of the ladder, and her own femur was torqued such that it crushed her knee and cartilage and her two lower leg bones. So it was a really bad break. And in the middle of my prep to go out to Alone and all of this gear I was making, I had to drop everything and go and live with my mom and get her house wheelchair accessible and care for her while she's recovering from this really bad accident. And she was just barely up and out of her chair and in a walker when I left. So she was on my mind a lot. And certainly while I was there for the experience, it's not like I didn't think about winning and how great that would be too. And I was just always thinking about, my mom may or may not be very mobile after this time, after this bad break. I don't know. But if I get that money, I want to do what I can to make sure that I am able to give my mom, I'm going to get emotional here, the highest quality of life possible, because she's a hiker and a kayaker and a very active person. And if she's not mobile from here on out, that's going to change her life. And it would be amazing to be able to provide, to provide for her in a way that she's still able to get out and do things, even if she has, less mobility than before. So her birthday was a big deal to me. And at this point, after the constipation I had been dealing with and finally moving through that, I was very adamantly collecting cranberries as often as the sun shone and melted them off. And I had both the harvest basket you saw last episode and a big storage basket as well. So I had cranberries on hand, and my mother loves cranberries. One of her favorite things, like at Thanksgiving, and she just keeps cranberry sauce on hand for putting on sandwiches. And so the feast that I spread was definitely with a mind to ancestors and myself and my mom, because she's kind of my closest ancestor, right? So I put on my rabbit costume. I used birch bark for the ears and charcoal for the whiskers and the nose, and just really, really present with the rabbits and the degree to which they're my ancestors too, and the degree to which they're making up the cells of my body at this point. So the least I can do is honor them on Halloween. And I brought in a flat slab of rock, and I set a beautiful table, and I made 3 plates on little birch bark slabs. One for myself, one for my mother for her birthday feast, and one for the ancestors. And I had a few more food items than they actually showed me talking about in that scene. So I did have the rabbit backstraps, and I had saved up fat so that I could really cook those nicely and sear them rather than boil them. And then I had a little strip of birch bark with cranberries. And then I did have the soup from the carcasses of the 2 rabbit day, which had been cooked down for a while, so it was just tender and delicious. And then I also had the organs of that squirrel I had caught that morning. So because I already had some food saved, I decided to save the squirrel for the next day, which is the Day of the Dead. So it's like 2 ancestor feast days in a row, one that's more European tradition and one that's more Latin American tradition. So I decided to have the organs of the squirrel on my Halloween feast, and you can see a little birch bark folded container that's holding all of those squirrel organs. So I made up a plate for each of us with all of those items and the cranberries, and first I ate my plate as myself, and then I ate my mom's plate for her and to bring her to the celebration, and then I ate the plates of the ancestors, standing in for the ancestors. So I had 3 plates of food and then the rabbit soup, and it was incredible. It's the only time up until this point that I sat down and had as much as I wanted to eat at a sitting, and what it did for the morale and my spirit and my energy and my body was so wonderful. Also, you can see in that scene, you can see on my table my spatula, and that was a spatula that I made early on within the first week, and it was my prayer for fish. I made it in anticipation of frying fish in my pan, and so you can see that the end of it is a trout. I carved a trout into the handle. And then also you can see me eating the soup with a spoon, and that was a spoon that I made as an homage to the grouse that you saw me shoot, and the handle of the spoon was a feather. So those are visible in that scene. And yeah, I had a fabulous feast day, and then went to bed with a full belly for the first time in, what was that, day 52, in 52 days. So it was awesome. And then the next day was the Day of the Dead, and I wanted a feast that day as well. So what I would tend to do when I didn't have a ton of food was to save it up and have one big meal that was actually satisfying rather than a bunch of little meals. So I went about my business and my trapping, and I believe I caught another rabbit on the Day of the Dead. But I saved that because I already had a whole squirrel, and another exciting meal, which was I saved the head of the rabbits and that one squirrel. So I had the whole squirrel carcass and then a soup of the 3 boiled heads. And the head of the animal is just so amazing. It's got all of the like the cheek meat and the eyeball meat and the jaw meat and the tongue, all delicious. But the big thing is the brain. So delicious and so fatty. So fatty. So that one meal, 2 rabbit heads and 1 squirrel head, was probably more calories than I had had at any one time that whole time. Not as much volume as the day before, but that was mostly lean meat the day before. So this day was like the fatty meal, and it was amazing. And it was the Day of the Dead, and I was having 3-head soup. So from that day, it became dubbed, of course, Day of the Head, Day of the 3-head soup. So, yeah, I was having a fabulous time. Those 2 days back to back were so good, and starting to get game again was such an answer to my prayers. And at this point, I'm getting squirrels with a little bit more regularity, as well as the rabbits starting to be back in. So I'm feeling good as of day 53, where I think it ended. And you know, it's interesting because I felt like that was shown kind of in contrast with a lot of the other folks out there. And the ice was coming big time. And you saw people being really worried about that and about the cold. And I have to say I was thrilled about it, because I knew that I had 0 fishing potential from my shore. So I had just been waiting and waiting and waiting for that ice to come, because ice meant ice fishing. And I was so ready to get some fish from that ice. Plus, the ice was so beautiful. It was so beautiful. And not only that, but once the ice came, it gave access to all of these areas that had just been like dreams, pipe dreams from that point on. You know, you would look across at a distant island and be like, wow, I wonder what's over there. Probably something amazing, but you couldn't get to them. So ice meant access to the entire area and access to fishing. So I had the opposite reaction to Barry when that ice came. I was like, holla freaking Luya. It's time. Ice. It is on. So I was doing great. And, you know, still had gone way too long with way too little food. Definitely really skinny. But my body felt good, and getting food back into it was good. And finally getting past the constipation was like a whole new life. It was amazing. So yeah, I'm feeling good and excited about things right then. And I think that this is where you see one of those really profound differences that come with positive mental attitude and with being there for my own reasons. So yes, I loved the idea of winning. I loved it partly because I was there to really represent, right? You've heard me talk about that so much. And what better way than showing that nature connection and approaching things from a feminine place and loving the place you are and being in reciprocal relationship with it are successful strategies than to win, right? But ultimately, it wasn't as much about winning for me as it was just being there and having these just epic times out in this amazing, remote, beautiful, vast, rugged, unpeopled area. It was so exhilarating. And there was something about the coming of the ice that just made it feel so much more exhilarating, because at that point, like, no one had access to this area. No one without a helicopter was getting near there. Not that I had seen evidence of anyone before. I had way less beach trash than anyone else. I didn't feel like it was a used area, whereas the other people getting barrels and buckets and stuff may have done. But yeah, that ice like sealed the deal. And at that point I felt like it was just me in the whole world, and it was exhilarating. And again, you really see, like, for people who are there with the goal of winning, they keep every medical check is an ordeal. And you see, like, Jordan knowing that he's missing his daughter's birthday, you know, you can see that people, it seems, my impression is that people are ready for it to be over. They're winding down and they just want to win and go home. And my strength out there was that I wanted to be right there. I mean, I was still building a bedstead. There was no part of me that wanted my important person to show up in a helicopter. I wanted to be there as long as possible. All I wanted was to do it with a little more food, which maybe ice fishing was going to give me. And the molt is over, so rabbits are back. So it's a time of real excitement and joy for me out there. And yeah, I feel like that came through with just how excited I was about my bunny outfit and my bedstead and all of those things. So yet again, just emphasizing positive mental attitude and being in love with the world and learning to live on beauty. Key survival skills. Key survival skills. Can't emphasize that enough. So, yeah, we didn't see any more dancing, but you better believe I was dancing. In fact, the Day of the Dead, I believe, was a Thursday. And so that day, I wanted to honor my ancestors, and I have Irish and Scottish ancestry. So that week, my dance party was some jigs out on the rocks, doing some little Irish jigs in honoring of my ancestors. Yeah, good times. Okay, friends. Well, that wraps up what I had to talk about in terms of episode 9. But I will just say, we got a little bit of a teaser of what's coming in episode 10, and what you saw of me was something I really considered not doing on camera. In fact, I think the first couple times I did it, I just turned off the camera because I felt a little bit sheepish about it. But yeah, I talk about how I ate everything that one could eat off of a rabbit, and that wasn't entirely true up until that point. I'd been holding back on something, and that was stomachs and intestines, which I was putting aside for bait for fish traps. At this point, though, the lake is frozen over, and I'm not getting a fish trap into that water, and if I did, it would probably freeze over and I would lose the fish trap. So all of a sudden, there was something else that I could be eating that I wasn't eating, and it took me a while to work myself up to it, and that's all I'm gonna say right now. But you saw a little sneak peek in the preview of what's to come, and we can go into that in more detail in my next episode discussion. And yeah, also, I just want to say how hard it was to watch Nikki go and her response. And that's the first person on this episode that got pulled, right? There are people who had emergency medical tap outs, but that's different than wanting to be there, feeling like you could be there, and being told by someone from the outside that you have to go. And I just was really feeling for her, because you can see how much she wanted to be there. She, like me, was about the experience and being there, and I just really felt her heartbreak and how much it would have broken my heart to be in her shoes right at that moment. So, another big emotional one. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone, and I will connect with you again once I get out of the wilderness and get to watch episode 10. Who knows what all is going to happen? Holy crap, huh? See you next time.